Okay, I'll pop out and leave you to introduce Ron.
Okay, our next presenter is Ron Ross, who is a person who in many ways started the business rules movement and worked hard all these years to push it from IT to business. Some people may feel uncomfortable when Ron criticizes our business rules products, forcing business people to do too much. But I believe Ron points us to challenges which we really need to address. Ron, take over.
Thank you, Jacob. Very kind, and thank you very much for including me in this distinguished group of colleagues. Much appreciated. So Jacob pretty much positioned me correctly. Many of you know a bit about my work and my thoughts in the area. Today, I'm going to limit myself just to talk about decision tables. And so Jan, you can put your video on and just do half the presentation. That'd be fine. Of course, I think many of you know my interest in rules is much larger than just decision tables. And there's a larger message that I want to emphasize today, and actually what's behind the scenes in my presentation. And that is that rules are first and foremost a human communication problem, not just an engineering problem. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that and therefore lose sight of what produces best results in terms of the quality of solutions. So I'm not sure we've always looked at the problem through exactly the right lens. And let me say a little bit more about that. Yesterday, I thought I heard some people saying that putting rules in decision services made them less accessible to business people. Now, surely I misheard that. Surely I didn't hear that right. So my belief and what I'll talk to you about today is that decision tables ought to speak more, not less, but more to business people, be more accessible, communicate more semantics. Okay. Now all I have to do is figure out how to advance my slides.
Click first on your screen.
Click first. Okay, thanks. So I won't say anything more about myself. I will say that I'm chair of the Building Business Capability Conference, and that's coming in May of next year, first or second week in May in Las Vegas. And I just mention that because I always seek and encourage and want to get all kinds of decision presentations and business rules presentations in front of our audience, which is not purely business rules or decision audience at all. We get quite a mix of people at BBC, including a lot of people who make decisions about how to go about implementing things. So what we've done this year is and this was my doing, is to put together a new building knowledge capability track. And I'm looking for all sorts of good rule-related decision table, DMN-related presentations to put into that. Now, you may ask, why knowledge? Well, we got to find something that attracts a general audience better, I think, than what we've been doing. So, yeah, but that's a discussion for a different day. And certainly, if anybody wants to talk to me more offline about that, be more than happy to. But the calls for speakers is out. The deadline is not that far away, so do keep that in mind. Okay, I think there's a great many ways decision tables could communicate better. And of course, we all know that Jan Bonthinian is a true pioneer in that regard. I think he's going absolutely in the right direction with the kind of questioning and the kind of, I won't say playing, but being able to evaluate decision tables and decision models in multiple dimensions. I do think there's a limit, however, that can be done without better quality in decision tables. But I'm not going to talk about that today, and he's the expert in that. What I am going to talk about is three things, more basic things with respect to decision table. First is business vocabulary, and let's call that sense making. We have to make sure that people that use decision tables can make sense out of them and carry away the right meaning from them. The second thing that I'll talk about a little bit later is scope. What is the applicable scope of any given decision table, and how is that communicated? Now, there may be some technical solutions to that that I'm not aware of, but in terms of human communication, I think it's an important issue. And then thirdly, I'll talk about exceptions and the handling of exceptions and my thoughts about that. And that'll lead me to a concept that we call knockout rules, which are behavioral rules that in many ways sort of in certain appropriate circumstances based on business policy override what a decision table may suggest. Okay, now I'm going to take a huge leap of faith on this first criteria, and that is about business vocabulary. I'm going to assume that all of you know that every term used in a decision table should be given a full, concise, complete, robust business definition. And I'm going to assume that all of your tools and all of your techniques and methods support it. And I'm going to assume that you remind all your customers and clients to do it. And I'm going to assume that you yourself do it religiously. Now, we're all seasoned professionals here, not to mention we are allegedly adults. And I think we all know that literally you can never be sure what you're talking about in a shared community of people unless terms are faithfully defined. And of course, you do want to share meaning with the rest of all the application sphere and of course, the rest of the world. So I'm going to take that as a given. It's a huge leap of faith, but let's just move forward from there. So the key thing then with respect to vocabulary, because I know some of you are interested in SBVR and kind of things it offers the world and how it relates to decision models, is to talk about structure. And the key product, the key deliverable from SBVR, or the key basis is a concept model, talking about what kinds of structure it brings to the table that will help with defining terms and bringing semantics to decision models and decision tables. So here we talk about a structured business vocabulary. So let me introduce several of the notions of structure using a very simple decision table example. And the way I'll do that is to talk about how decision tables typically evolve. See if this corresponds to your practice in analysis and so on. Let me give you a little bit of background on this sample that I'm going to use here. My business partner, who many of you know, is Gladys Lamb, and she lives in Vancouver. And please do remember that fact because it is going to become important later. Now, Gladys living in Vancouver, and many of you know the climate there is a bit rainy at times and can also be cool, is that she has a problem, is that every day when she wakes up, gets ready to go out. Of course, we don't go out as much as we used to, but her husband, Sonny, and I have listened to her for many years and try to decide what coat she should wear to go out on any given day. So to help out with that, we created a little simple decision table. And the question that we think we're trying to answer here is, what coat should I wear today? And it has two considerations, the temperature, how cold is it? And what's the precipitation? Is it rainy? Is it not rainy? It's a cross-tab type table, to use Jean's term for it, or DMN term. And you can see in the intersection cells are the appropriate decision: line raincoat, wool overcoat, unlined raincoat, or none at all. So that's the decision table. It's very simple. I chose the simplest example I could possibly think of. That's the problem we face. So how does this work? Well, the first thing you need to do, of course, is you need to define terms. I'm not going to give you definitions, but I will relate it to a bit of structure. And if you're creating a concept model for this, a structured business vocabulary, you'll want to organize these terms in a way that makes sense. So coat, that's one of the terms that's used in the decision table, is a category of article of clothing. That's what that heavy dark line means in terms of the concept model. And I'm giving three instances of coat: lined raincoat, underlined raincoat, and wool overcoat, because that's what's used in those terms are used in the decision table. And I'm oversimplifying here, but weather conditions, let's just say there's two examples or instances of that. It's cold or rainy. So the idea is that I'm coordinating the vocabulary as I go. And remember, these terms all have full definitions in order to make sense of what the table says and to be sure that it communicates effectively. Now, let's talk about what happens as we continue with our decision analysis. The decision table is going to evolve. I'm going to notice that it says, no, it's not cold, but I'm going to ask the question, does that mean it's not cold? Does that mean warm? Or does it mean just moderate? And is there a differential answer or decision based on which is the case? And so probably in dealing with Gladys, it turns out that yes, indeed, there is a differential answer to the question. So if it's moderate and rainy, she'll wear an unlined raincoat. Precipitation, she'll wear a sweater if it's not rainy. And then if it's warm, she uses an umbrella, and she doesn't use anything at all if it is not rainy. So the decision table's evolved. I've gotten more logic, and you'll notice that I've also gotten more terms here. So of course, we need to keep things in sync with our vocabulary and the decision table to make sure that we always are making sense, communicating effectively with business stakeholders. So what I want you to notice here, and this was deliberate, and this is our practice, but we recommend it strongly, is that we included the question that the decision table answers within the decision table itself. So the question I started off with was, what coat should I wear today? Now I've got a couple of newcomers, sweater and umbrella, a couple of new concepts, a couple of new terms that are not coats. So suddenly my vocabulary and its structure have gotten a little bit out of line with the decision table. The terminology and the structure not aligned with the decision table. So I've added a little bit weather conditions. It could be temperature, the two categories of weather condition, temperature, precipitations. Now I've got cold, moderate, and warm. And also for code, I've got the same instances. But let's look what has happened is that sweater and umbrella are not coats. An umbrella is not something that you wear. So the question I thought I was answering, I'm no longer answering. And so I've modified the question in order to keep in sync with the decision table and the vocabulary. So I've modified it to what weather gear is appropriate today. Now, that may or may not be the best choice, but I think the insight is that we always have to be clear as decision tables evolve, exactly what is the question that we're answering, and to make sure the vocabulary is clear in that regard. And most importantly, to communicate it effectively to our various stakeholders and partners. So we do that religiously, we document it clearly, we keep it visible, and we make it, we make sure it's up to date as the table evolves. Okay, so we keep our concept model, our vocabulary in line with that too. We indicate that umbrellas and sweaters are instances of weather gear. They're not instances of coat, and so on. We keep things in sync. So the insight here, and this is a trivial example, and I couldn't give you a full concept model, full vocabulary to motivate the example. But we all know that the complexity when within and across decision tables is many orders of magnitude greater, oftentimes, than what I'm showing here. And so we feel strongly that you need a blueprint to the meaning that you're trying to communicate. And that's what concept model provides. That's the basic correlation between SBVR and DMN. So just to sort of wrap that up, there are three basic elements of structure within SBVR. Classification, which means putting things in the right buckets. In other words, what's an instant of what? What are instances of classes? That's the first, and I illustrated that a bit. Categorization, which I didn't emphasize, but really is doing battle with type codes. And so that's a whole different discussion. But type codes really are killers when it comes to most forms of communication, especially with people outside your immediate community. And then the third thing that concept models offer, which I don't have time to go into here, is verb concepts, which really has to do with fighting ambiguity. I wish I had more time, more opportunity to talk about those, but I really don't. Okay, so let's move along to the second area where decision tables could communicate, I feel, better to humans. And what we all know is that context is often and actually always important in any form of communication. And that's just as true for decision tables, which, as I emphasize, is just another form of human communication. You take a decision table out of context, it's not going to mean exactly what you think it means, and it's not going to do exactly what you think it does. And the way I'll approach that today is to talk about scope and applicability or applicability criteria. So to do that, motivate that, let's go back to Gladys's coat decision table as an example. And do remember a couple of things I told you. First of all, rules, including in decision tables, are about human communication, not just engineering. The second thing I told you, and I did remind you to remember, is that Gladys lives in Vancouver. She travels a lot, or used to anyway. And this decision table that Sunny and I put together, Sunny, her husband, doesn't necessarily work in Los Angeles or Houston or New York or Brussels or just anywhere else you go. So the decision table is not really applicable anywhere except Vancouver. Now, why doesn't the decision table say that somewhere? Why doesn't it announce it? Why doesn't it declare that? Because you could easily misuse it if you apply it anywhere else. Another relevant fact, and this should also be obvious, is that this table, Sunny and I put it together just for Gladys. It doesn't apply to any other person. Someone else might have different criteria for what coat or what weather gear they should use on any particular day. Why doesn't the table declare that as well? Why doesn't it say it? Why doesn't it communicate it? So the question is, why isn't the table more explicit about its semantics or its applicability? Don't you think that that would be useful for reuse and to avoid misuse? You know, I certainly think it would. So let's talk a little bit deeper about that and think about decision tables and how they should declare their proper context of usage and communicate that to people. So as we said before, typically with a decision table, you might start off with one scope only to realize as you go along, and I'm sure this has happened to you as well, that you've really bitten off more than you can chew. So you decide you better narrow the scope. You better limit it to the number of cases that it really addresses. So here in this example, there's a typical kind of insurance case. So we're handling real world cases where an average Joe applies for auto insurance. We hand that over to the decision logic, the decision model, the decision table. It gives us some potential outcomes, but the scope was, of course, auto insurance, but apparently the original scope was that it applies anywhere for any amount of insurance. And it can either give you a definitive outcome for that, or it can't, in which case it'll hand it back to a human to resolve that decision. But, you know, what's going to happen is we're going to realize that's probably too large a scope. We're going to narrow our scope and we're going to say, hey, you know, we really only want to consider the USA and let's only consider cases under $1 million. And we can work much better within that scope, and we can limit the complexity of the decision table and really have a much more success with it. Now, somewhere along the line, I should have considered it if I haven't considered it before. Now is the time. So assuming we want to limit the scope to not any kind of insurance, but auto insurance and auto insurance only in the USA and auto insurance under $1 million, somewhere we need to express that and we need to make it very clear and very visible. And there's a couple of ways you can do that. Again, I don't know exactly what your techniques are. The way we do that, and you know, we pretty much insist on this methodology wise, is that we always have the question that the decision table answers. That's part of the declaration for the decision table. And the question has to use standard vocabulary, and it has to declare its criteria for applicability. So notice the question up there says, is an applicant eligible for auto insurance for the USA under $1 million? Or I could do this a little differently. I could segregate the cases in scope from the question, if you want to keep the question simple, and say the questions in scope, auto insurance, USA under $1 million. Now that revised scope is much more doable. It's much more tractable in the sense that it doesn't have nearly as many conditions, and therefore I can hopefully keep the decision table relatively simple. But again, you know what's going to happen as we move along in analyzing the decision and evolving the decision table is we're going to come across more cases. And do those cases fall in scope or not? So suppose we bump into Bill Gates, and Bill Gates wants some auto insurance, but it's over $1 million. Well, currently that's not in scope, but for the sake of argument, let's make sure that, let's say that we want it in scope of the decision table. So we want to consider that possibility. Probably not the best choice, but what we want to do is declare that. So again, what we could do is we, could modify the question, or we could expand the cases in scope. So I've done that specifically here. Any application is submitted by an applicant that is for the product auto insurance. Now I'm being a little bit tighter about vocabulary now. I think that's extremely useful, and we do it religiously. Can never be sure that someone on the other end, no matter how clear you think your logic is, will interpret what you intended and will apply it only in the correct situations. It's for a policy that covers the USA and request a coverage amount less than $1 million. And then I added in a new condition, or is Bill Gates. So I've expanded the scope of what this decision table should be covering. Now, just as an observation as we go along, in that second bullet, you'll notice that we said it is for a policy that covers, it could say the country USA. Covers is a verb concept in SPVR terms, and SPVR would have you not only standardize verb concepts, noun concepts, but verb concepts as well, and give you standard wordings for those, so that across all the many places where you use the verbs in writing rule statements and in articulating things like this, that you have a common vocabulary and even defined if you need it. So also to illustrate verb concepts in SPVR, notice cases and scope says any application that is submitted by an applicant. So that's another verb concept. That's another predicate, if you will. And SPVR would have you standardize that in the sense that if anybody's going to talk about the relation between application and applicant, and they mean is submitted by, they ought to be using that vocabulary, not some other vocabulary that's at odds with what other people, how other people might articulate it and express it. Okay, well, I got off on a little bit of a tangent there about verb constructs and SPVR, but let's come back to Bill Gates. And I think probably most of you would recognize this is not a good decision. It's not a good choice, I should say, to include Bill Gates in the scope of the original decision, because the considerations that we're likely to use to decide whether we want to support auto insurance for Bill Gates are going to be quite different from our average Joe in his request for, his or her request for auto insurance less than 1 million. So notice at this point, in order to differentiate the two decisions, I added a little more vocabulary. I generalized Bill Gates up there in the question, and then I said Fortune 500 billionaire. So this is a new class, a new category of potential applicants or people in the world. And Bill Gates would be an example or instance of Fortune 500 billionaire. That is also something I want to keep in my vocabulary and keep that in sync, make sure I have a clear definition, make sure that Bill Gates is known as an example of that case. So always the vocabulary part is complementing the decision model, the decision table part, in order to be clear what I'm trying to express and what the coverage is. So I think at this point, we probably would go with separate decision models, possibly, or at least differentiate that at a top level in order to have different logic, different decision tables that covers those various cases. Okay, the third thing I want to talk about, also talking about how decision tables can communicate better. And here we're going to get into the organization of decision tables and what makes decision tables so complex sometimes, which, large and unwieldy. I'm sure your experience is like mine. It inevitably happens. And in many cases, it's because we're trying to handle exceptions in the structure of the decision table itself, rather than somehow externalizing them so that we have, sort of standard, common, normal logic in the decision table. So to illustrate the point, and then we'll look at a different example, but to illustrate the point first, let's talk about Gladys and her decision coat problem. And as I mentioned before, first, the thing we need to declare, we need to be clear about what is the question we're answering. So I have what weather gear is appropriate today, not what coat should she wear. But now I've also declared in an association with the decision table, where does it apply? Applicability conditions, the location is strictly Vancouver, not any other city. Person is Gladys. And if we wanted to expand the scope to other cities and other people, the decision table could become very complicated. But let's leave that aside for the moment. The one thing I didn't tell you about Gladys, which I should tell you, is that she does not obligate herself to use her own decision table. She can and she does often ignore the outcome from the decision table anytime she wants, sometimes unpredictably, but predictably on certain occasions. For example, on Halloween, she dresses up as a fairy godmother. And, that is her practice. And that's an exception to the normal logic, depending on temperature and precipitation. And essentially that predictable exception knocks out the usual logic that we so neatly and nicely accumulated in this particular table. Now, here's the question in terms of communication, human communication. Why doesn't the decision table declare that? Why doesn't it warn you about that? Why doesn't it tell you? It's a known exception, and it certainly would be helpful. So I think declaring known exceptions would be really helpful for reuse and to avoid misuse of the decision logic here. So let's work through, an insurance example, the same insurance example as before, to try to make that point about exceptional cases and how they so often sort of crap up our otherwise nice, neat, and clean logic. So back to insurance, back to our normal kinds of example. And so we have the real world cases where an ordinary applicant applies for auto insurance, decision logic does its thing, and then we get an outcome selected from our potential outcomes. And what you need, of course, we all know this, in order to create a decision table and also to make that determination is we need considerations. So we'll decide what the normal considerations are for normal kinds of insurance applications, and they have to do with driving history and evidence of insurability, insurance risk score, credit rating, state and province or province, and things of that nature. And maybe 95% of all our cases follow those conditions, and we put them together in order to come with the appropriate outcome. So let's take an example of that. For a normal case, we have Joe Bob Taylor. I don't know if you know this, but in Texas, a lot of people put double names together. I don't know why that's the case, but so anyway, Joe Bob is a Texan, and he is a normal applicant. He's an ordinary applicant. His driving history only has one accident. He can give facts of current insurance card for evidence of insurability. His insurance risk score is okay. His credit rating is good. He lives in Texas, etc. He's perfectly ordinary in all these respects. And so he's not an exceptional case. So let me look a little closer what I mean by normal versus exceptional. A normal case is one that is regular and common in that it uses all the normal or uses most of the usual considerations, the criteria for reaching an outcome. And you cannot exclude it from normal treatment. You can't reject it out of hand because of some overriding condition, some overriding rule, we might say. So Joe Bob's is not an exception, because an exception is a case that's irregular or uncommon. It uses none of the usual considerations, the special considerations, and it can be excluded from normal treatment, or it can be just rejected out of hand because of some overriding criteria that we have. So that's how we differentiate between normal and exceptional. And you come across these all the time. So Joe Bob, he's good. He's a normal applicant, ordinary applicant. Typical case, we can use it, the normal decision logic to reach his outcome. We can keep the decisions table simple in that regard. But then along comes Sally Sue Cox. She's an applicant, and it turns out that Sally Sue is a felon. And we have a policy, we have a business policy that we do not accept people who've been convicted of felons as successful candidates for insurance. Our policy is to reject felons out of hand. There's no need to look at all the usual considerations because they just don't matter. Driving history, evidence of insurability, insurance risk score, credit rating. And as Jacob was talking about, if you wanted to minimize cost, maybe going and getting a credit rating is expensive. If you looked at this exception issue, this criminal history thing, and you found out this first, you wouldn't need to do anything else because you can reject this application out of hand because as a matter of policy, you're just not going to accept her. So what we call this is a knockout rule. And that's just to have a name for it because it knocks out the usual logic. In fact, we have a policy, and it's a business policy. And the policy, we could write it out as a rule statement. An applicant for auto insurance must be declined if convicted of a felony involving a motor vehicle. And let me point out a couple of things about that. First of all, it is natural to write a policy rule like this in structured English. It's just natural. Rob Parker yesterday, even though his presentation was cut short, he made a really interesting comment. I don't know if you caught it or not, but I almost stood up and applauded, even though my video wasn't on. And that is that he said instead of starting with decisions, they went to the policy manual to start their analysis of what they needed to do. Well, yeah, policy is about running the business. That's where you're going to find, the basic governing rules of the organization. And I'll go even further than that because I have to be controversial at least once. Maybe I've already been controversial and didn't know it. And that is that, the place that really, when you get to looking at decisions, you're really already thinking about how you're going to automate. You're not thinking about the business policy and running the business and what it takes to run the business and keeping the shape of interactions and transactions in the proper form. You're already thinking about, well, this is a bunch of complex rules. How am I going to automate these rules? Now, I know that decision models and decision tables were not necessarily standardized or built strictly for automation. And Jan made a perfectly good point for that. But it is also the case that the DMN standard and so on was put together in order to ensure the automatability of certain kinds, but not all kinds, of business logic. Okay, anyway, I'm getting off the track there a little bit. It wouldn't be a Ron Ross presentation if I didn't sort of bring up that kind of question. Anyway, don't forget, people have businesses to run before they have decisions to automate, and they have policies and they have basic guidelines to follow. And a lot of times these basic policies will preempt the outcome you get from decisions. So again, the point here about Sally Sue, she is a felon, and our policy is just not to accept felons for insurance policy. If you know that out of hand, you can reject. You don't even have to look at the decision logic. You can reject it out of hand and move forward. We call that a knockout rule. Another example. Here along comes Slick Willie. Slick Willie Jones has been playing computer games since he was 3 years old. He loves to, troll insurance companies and hack things and so on. So he decides at 13 years of age that he's going to try to apply for insurance. Well, no, he's not going to get insurance. All the regular considerations, driving history, evidence of insurability, insurance risk score, credit rating, state, province, all that stuff, it doesn't matter. Because if you know Slick Willie's only 13 years old, you're not going to give him insurance. It's a matter of policy not to do that. So you can preempt, you can knock out his application because we have this overriding policy that no matter what the rest of the decision logic says, he's not going to get the policy because of this criteria. Now, let me observe. You imagine and you think why a lot of decision tables get so complex. And there's a very simple reason for it, is because people try to work in these exceptions along with the quote unquote normal logic or the ordinary cases or the usual considerations, and it really craps up your decision tables. It creates rows or columns or intersections with just one consideration, nothing else applies, which explodes the volume of your decision table, and is really sort of hard to interpret why that particular rule is in with all the other rules that seem to be very complete with the set of conditions that they address. Okay, well, I probably beat that in the ground, but just to summarize what I'm saying is that, again, we're very explicit about the criteria that are applicable in setting up a decision, meaning what's the question that it answers, what's the applicable scope, and what are the exceptions, meaning what are the knockout rules that can be applied, so that you don't even need to look at the normal decision logic. We find that works so much better. It has to do with the semantics of the problem. It has to do with the quality of the logic and ensuring you're not getting over your head and using a good metaphor, which can be wildly abused. I'm talking specifically about decision tables. And please don't anybody misunderstand me. I think decision tables are great. We use them in our practice all the time. We're just careful in these regards in order to ensure we get the best results, not just for engineering a solution, but for communicating the applicability so that it can be tested along with all the other logic and used and reused appropriately. Okay, so back to our Gladys example. And what I told you is essentially that there is a knockout rule for this weather gear decision table. And that is the knockout rule exception that occurs only on Halloween. She wears a fairy godmother costume, and that's just what she does. And that is a predictable exception as opposed to many of her unpredictable exceptions. She only uses the result of the decision table as a recommendation, not as a hard and fast decision. Now, again, with these examples, I picked the simplest decision tables and the simplest decision problems that I could possibly think of. We all know that the real world is far more complex, which just complicates the problems I've discussed by many orders of magnitude. So the bottom line here is I'm telling you that by externalizing semantics, and I've sort of broadened the notion of the semantics beyond just the vocabulary that applies to the decision logic here into talking about other areas, applicability conditions, knockout rules. You know, we make our results, our analytical results, our human results far more useful if we do that. Now, I don't know, you know, I'm not up on all the DMN techniques, and I'm not up on all the products. And so there's a huge variety, and that would take pretty much all my time to do that. Maybe you have some clever solutions to these problems I've talked about. But I want you to be honest, even if you do have technical solutions to what I've talked about, how well do they really work? How well do they really work for reuse in other areas, for human communication, and for analysis of the results, not just the execution of the decision? Now, I also know many, or maybe even most of you, like to avoid semantics wherever you can. I mean, that unfortunately seems to be highly characteristic of the community. And that's true even for decision tables. Well, there's a price to be paid for that. And hopefully today, I've shown you what some of those prices are and how also we could do better if we would admit them into our practice. So the question I posed at the beginning of the presentation was, can decision tables communicate better? And the answer is, of course, yes, they can. Jan is exploring all sorts of neat ways in which they can we can wring out more logic, more insight from decision tables. I think that is the most important direction. But I'm also saying by adding some common sense things like business vocabulary, sense making, scope, applicability, exceptions, knockout rules based on policies, and so on, we can do even better. Really thinking about decision tables as a human communication problem. This is not just an engineering problem. Okay,
Thanks,
finally.
Ron. Yeah, no, that's really great. But we gotta wrap things up pretty soon here because we're almost at the okay.
I got one more thing to say.
Okay.
Thanks, Jacob, for putting on DecisionCAMP. It's always a great pleasure to participate and enjoying this. And I know how much hard work it is. So thank you very much. And Sandy for being an excellent best of class moderation person. And finally,
I'm really glad you could be here, Ron.
And finally, it's great seeing all you colleagues here, even if it's only virtual, maybe next year physical.
Now, I definitely want to see Gladys in that fairy godmother costume. So I'm going to have to go to Vancouver at Halloween some year because that's something I have to see.
Usually, if I was in a public seminar with people who didn't know Gladys, I might say a witch costume, but I decided that wasn't nice, and so
fairy godmother, witch, it's it's a bit of a balance there.
It's sort of yin or yang.
Yeah. Now we do have actually, Denis and Jan had some sort of similar questions. So Denis had said, should decision scope considerations, knockout rules be added as new input parameter requirements to the decision? And Jan said, just so that, then Jan asked, should scope be part of the table or part of the context? In other words, the DRD. So I think the issue of scope is kind of an interesting one here.
Yeah. Well, my feeling is that decision tables can be used, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it could be used in more than one decision model, and also can be used apart from decision models. And so I think that a particular decision model, particularly if you want it to be reusable, those criteria need to go along with the decision table. Yes, and I'm sure you could do that for the whole decision model. You would, and then I guess the applicability and exceptions and everything would apply to everything in the decision model. So I guess it could be done either way. I hadn't really thought about that, but
yeah,
yes.
and then Jacob had a sort of a follow-up to Jan's question and said there could be multiple glossaries inside the same decision model, so that if a decision variable is used by several different decision tables, it goes into a glossary. But if it's just an intermediate variable only for that table, then it's better to keep it within its context. So it probably depends on how widely it's going to get used as well.
Yeah, so I'll give you the theocratic answer to that, which is all of our logic and all of our applications should be using a common business vocabulary. And so, for me, you really have to convince me that there's a need for separate glossaries across a decision model. And I can understand if you're piecing together stuff from different sources that would require some vocabulary mapping, but I'm not clear that should be done within the decision model per se. I think that vocabulary and semantics is something that maybe should provide an umbrella for what we're doing within decision models. But that's the off of my top of my head answer, and that may not hold true.
Okay, and Alan has a question he wanted to ask himself. Go ahead, Alan.
Hi, Ron. First thing is to say, I think, especially as we move forward into making decision resources more shareable, towards perhaps providing marketplaces in which intellectual property and decision making could be shared amongst people, reused, even bought and sold. What you're talking about, expressing somehow what the domain of applicability is of any particular decision resource is extremely important. So I agree with you entirely about the need for such things, and in particular, I'm finding it hard to believe I'm saying this, but it does. It really does underline the need for some sort of underlying semantics which goes across different decision makers, so that you can decide whether a particular resource is appropriate in your environment. I think with the particular example you use of eligibility rules is a little unfortunate, because in most applications, eligibility is actually a separate decision. So it's not really necessary. And actually, this is the reason it's done like this. If you try to express eligibility as knockout rules for each of the decision tables or each of the rule sets in your application, it would be hugely complicated. So what people do instead is they have a single eligibility decision where all these knockout rules are gathered together, and they control the reaction of the whole application over and above the decisions about what you would do with the applicant if they're not rejected.
Is there a decision table in that decision, or
there might not? Typically, in applications I've been involved with, eligibility rules tend to be expressed as a rule set rather than a table, because they tend to use factors which don't interact amongst the various rules.
Exactly, because they're based on policy and they're one of a kind, and they need structured vocabulary even more, especially if you want them broadly computable. Now, within field, I suppose if you've translated the vocabulary, they could be computable, but I would suspect once they get into field, they're less accessible to the business people and the policy makers, and therefore we've lost some of the business touch that we would like to retain.
Okay, so we're going to have to stop there
Okay.
because it's only a couple minutes till the keynote. So I put the link in both Slack and the Zoom chat of how to get to the declarative AI